I, 37M, spent 10 years building my family's business from the ground up. We started small, barely scraping by at $2 million in revenue. By the time I was done, we had grown into a $50 million powerhouse. I sacrificed everything for it. Late nights, missed vacations, and relationships that fell apart because the business came first. But it was worth it, or so I thought. Then my sister, who had never lifted a finger for the company, stood up at my father's 70th birthday party and humiliated me in front of everyone. She tapped her glass, smiled sweetly, and said, "You're worthless. Time to step aside." The whole room went silent. People actually stopped mid-conversation to stare. I blinked, convinced I misheard. Then my father, sitting at the head of the table, slowly nodded, like he had been expecting this moment. "She's right," he said, just like that, like I was some temp worker whose contract had ended. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for anything that would tell me this wasn't real. But my sister just kept going. "Dad built this company, not you. You just rode his success. It's time for real leadership." And then she smiled. This slow, triumphant smirk like she had just won something. I should have exploded. Should have caused a scene. Instead, I just stood up, walked out, and drove home. I wasn't going to argue in front of 100 people. But I wasn't stupid. Something was going on, and I was going to find out exactly what. The next morning at 9 a.m. sharp, my father, my sister, and some corporate lawyer I had never met marched into my office like they already owned the place. No greetings, no small talk, just a thick folder slammed onto my desk. The lawyer adjusted his tie and said, "You are to step down as CEO immediately. Your shares will be transferred, and you'll receive a severance package, contingent on a non-compete agreement. If you sign today, we can make this transition smooth." I flipped through the papers. They were serious. They were trying to push me out of my own company. I looked at my father, the man who had once told me this company would be mine someday. And if I don't sign, the lawyer smiled like he had already won. That would be messy. Lawsuits, public disputes. It would be unwise. They thought I would just roll over, that I would take their money and disappear. Instead, I tore the contract in half and tossed it in the trash. "Get out," I said, calm and steady. My father's jaw tightened. My sister's face twisted in rage. The lawyer just sighed like I was some idiot making things harder for myself. "You'll regret this," my sister hissed. I smiled. "No, you will." Because I wasn't going down without a fight. First thing I did, called my personal attorney, someone who wasn't tied to my family. He listened carefully, then let out a low whistle. "They're trying to force you out through legal loopholes. But they can't just take your shares. That severance package? That's hush money. So what's my move? You dig. You find out why they're so desperate to get rid of you." And so I did. I called our CFO, someone I trusted, and told him to discreetly send me the last 6 months of financials. Then I started reaching out to key employees, people who had been with me for years, people who knew things. And what I found, it was worse than I imagined. My father and sister had been bleeding the company dry behind my back. Fake consulting fees, overpriced contracts with shell companies that led right back to them. Millions of dollars gone. And the kicker? They had already lined up a buyer. A private equity firm was set to acquire a majority stake. But they needed me out first, because I was the only one who could stop it. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was fraud. So I did what they never expected. I gathered every piece of evidence, every fraudulent transaction, every shady deal. Then I made 3 calls. 1, to my lawyer to prepare for war. 2, to the IRS, because tax fraud was now on the table. 3, to a journalist I knew, someone who loved exposing corporate corruption. Then I sat back and waited. And when the hammer dropped, it was glorious. First, the IRS launched an audit. Turns out, when you're stealing millions and trying to hide it, they take an interest. Fast. Then the SEC got involved. Because when you're planning to sell a $50 million company under false pretenses, that's securities fraud. The private equity firm? They backed out immediately. They wanted nothing to do with the mess. And my father? He tried to call me. Left a voicemail. His voice, once so authoritative, now shaking. "Son, we need to talk. This is getting out of hand." I didn't call back. Then came the media bombshell. The journalist published everything. How they had been funneling money, how they try to push me out to cover it up. Their reputations were destroyed overnight. And finally, the arrests. Yep, arrests. Because the IRS and SEC don't just audit people, they press charges. My father and sister were both charged with tax evasion and corporate fraud. Their accounts were frozen. The courts came down hard. My father got 3 years in prison. My sister, 5 years. She had been a mastermind behind most of the fraud, and the court didn't go easy on her. And the best part? They had to sell everything to pay back what they stole. The mansions? Gone. The luxury cars? Gone. My sister, who once called me worthless, ended up penniless. Last I heard, she was working some minimum wage job, complaining about how unfair life was. And me? I was still the majority shareholder. I took control. Clean house. Brought in real leadership, people who had stood by me. My father tried to reach out after he got out of prison. I never answered, because family doesn't do what they did to me. And the company? Stronger than ever. They thought they could steal what I built. They were wrong. Oh, and if you like this, subscribe. Unlike my sister, I actually know how to build something that lasts.